The whole world is talking about the tragedy that unfolded in Israel on October 7th. Was this tragedy the result of a diabolical New World Order conspiracy, or is it simply the result of miscalculations on the part of the military, the Shin Bet, and the government? Stay tuned for a down-to-earth handling of this subject. Hi there, I'm Lee Brainerd. Welcome to Soothkeep and another edition of Prophecy in the Crucible. My mission is truth, truth at any cost, truth above every other consideration, and of course the truth that we're trying to address today is what really went down in Israel on October 7th. Let's start with an introduction to the subject. And my first thing I want to bring out is a clarification. This video is not a denial of the fact of the existence of conspiracy theories. This video is aimed at helping men to realize that there is a distinction between genuine conspiracies and conspiracy theories, and to help them learn to discern the difference between a genuine conspiracy theory and a genuine conspiracy. Now, true conspiracies do exist. For instance, the New World Order is a vast conspiracy. It involves a dozen or more smaller conspiracies which are aimed at destroying the energy sector and the food sector and biblical morality and freedom and independence, and which forward such nefarious ideologies as man-caused global warming, perversion, and depopulation. So what is the difference between a genuine conspiracy theory and a genuine conspiracy? Well, true conspiracies are based on facts that can be found lying on the surface. These facts force the candid researcher to embrace the conspiracy. No other offered explanation actually explains what happened or what is happening. But conspiracy theories require men to go down the rabbit hole. They must discount a ready explanation that's lying right there on the surface. They must discount any explanation that's based on mundane causes like complacency, lack of foresight, misguided policies, dropping the ball. They must dive down the rabbit hole and concern themselves with esoteric information, strained connections, questionable correlations, dubious history, recycled theories, hearsay, and interpretations that are little more than speculations. I have a basic principle when it comes to dealing with conspiracy theories. I never embrace a conspiracy theory interpretation for a situation if it can be readily explained with mundane things like complacency, miscalculation, misguided policies, lack of foresight and planning, dropping the ball, just everyday mistakes. Well, let's take a look at the conspiracy interpretation. The theory says that Netanyahu knew that the attack was coming and he allowed it to happen so he could justify taking on Hamas. He also, theoretically, supposedly, told the IDF to stand down for 7 hours so the tragedy as it unfolded would be even more awful. Now, this conspiracy theory has wormed its way through the internet, wormed its way through talk shows, but I have been unable at this point to track down anything that has real substance in it in defense of this theory. Oh, a friend with connections in high places heard from somebody else in high places that Netanyahu ordered the IDF to stand down for 7 hours. Okay, someone heard that somebody heard. Has anyone tried to trace this to a trustworthy, reputable source? Have they found out where this actually originated? Or do we just believe whatever cool theories the internet trots out? I can't imagine such a thing actually happening. If Netanyahu had said such a thing, certainly some of his high-ranking officers and high-ranking officials would have said something, and they would have publicly voiced their disagreement. Israelis are not easily embarrassed. They're not afraid to voice their opinion. They've voiced their opinion in the past when they've disagreed with the direction that their state was taking. Now, there are three main arguments given for believing in the conspiracy theory. I've seen this over and over and over again in the posts that I've read and in blog posts that I've read in internet articles. The first one is that Israel has the most sophisticated intelligence in the world. That may well be true. And if they're not number one, they're probably number two. And so the theory says because they have the most sophisticated intelligence in the world, there's no way the government didn't know that this was going to happen. Well, this is a big assumption. Doubtless intelligence had picked up some intriguing chatter and rumors, and they've said as much. But terrorists have been talking big smack for 3 decades. And the precedent that's been set for 3 decades is 10 pounds of big talk and 1 ounce of little walk. Was anyone supposed to think that this was going to be different? Now, is it possible that they misinterpreted some intel because of their prejudice in this direction? Well, yeah, it's very likely. But I can guarantee you that this is going to make some changes in the Shin Bet and in the military intelligence community. Their policies in this way are going to, in these matters, are going to change. Now, the second argument that people make for the conspiracy theory is that the global cabal controls everything that's going on in the world. No, they don't. Don't make the mistake of assuming that the global cabal already controls the whole world and they're calling the shots for the whole world. This is not true. Ultimately, the global cabal is not going to have absolute control over the entire world until the middle of the 70th week. Now, and currently, folks, you have to understand this or you know absolutely nothing about the New World Order. Currently, there are at least 8 versions of the New World Order fighting and jockeying to dominate the world. You've got the American conservative position and the American liberal position. You have the European position, which has a few sub-flavors. You have the Russian position. You have the Chinese position. You have the secret societies. Then you have the power players in the banking and the financial world. You have the Roman Catholic version. You have the Islamic version. There's probably more versions out there. They're all fighting and struggling to gain dominance over the entire world. They all want to be the king of the hill. Now, ultimately, if we trust the scriptures, the Roman cabal is ultimately going to seize control over Europe, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and then they're going to spread that domination over to extended Europe and the Middle East and North Africa, and then ultimately over the entire world. And the Roman cabal is probably going to be combined of Europe and its colonies like America and New Zealand and Australia and Canada, along with the great power players from America and Europe that are in the financial world, the economic world, and also with the involvement of the secret societies. These things are probably going to coalesce into one organization ultimately. Now, the efforts right now that we're seeing of the proto-Roman cabal in Israel and the Middle East are not an expression of the fact that they are already calling the shots in the entire world. And they're not even calling the shots in Israel. This is rather just an effort on their part to strengthen their position in the Middle East and to exploit the opportunity. They want to dominate the world. The Bible holds out the fact that they are going to dominate the world. And they're acting in character, but they don't dominate the whole world yet. They don't even dominate themselves yet. They don't even dominate Israel yet. Now, The Roman cabal right now is swinging deals with Israel. And their help is going to come with a price. And this reminds me of the treaty that's going to be forced upon Israel by the Roman Empire in the future. Now, the third argument that people put forth for the conspiracy theory version is simply that I can't trust my government anymore. Well, yeah, I empathize with you there. However, this, folks, is a subjective argument. It's not an objective argument. And this argument wouldn't be admitted in any court of law. And if it wouldn't be admitted in a court of law, why do we admit it in this question at hand? And furthermore, the I don't trust my government argument doesn't favor the conspiracy theory interpretation. There's nothing in it that leans the needle towards a conspiracy theory. You can just as well not trust your government over everyday mistakes, everyday complacency, everyday bad policies, everyday leftist leanings, everyday corruption, everyday incompetence, everyday dropping the ball. We don't even need a conspiracy theory to not trust our government. Now, let's look at the mundane causes interpretation of what happened in Israel. And I'm going to present here nine mundane, that is, non-conspiracy variables that came together for a perfect storm in Israel on October 7th. Some of these variables point to complacency in the military, in the intelligence community, and in the government. Some of them point to bad policies that blew up in the face of the officials that imposed them. And some of them point to Hamas being much better trained and organized than had been anticipated. Now, I gathered these points from articles that are published in the public domain on public news sources like Haaretz, the Jerusalem Post, and GIS Online. Now, I do suspect that these 9 points and the failures that are involved there are going to lead to policy changes in the future. Now, the first variable is that there was overconfidence in the border fence. The border fence is accompanied with an underground barrier that prevents tunneling into Europe. It also is associated with incursion sensors and remote-controlled weapons. And the anti-tunneling barrier was completed in March of 2021. And around the time that the border security here was in its final form and finished, the policies for the defense of the region began to change. The Israeli army believed that the chance of terrorist incursion after the recent enhancements of the border fence was close to zero. They thought it was a non-existent problem. And this opinion was largely backed in the political arena and in the media. Now, this overconfidence of the military led them to reduce their forces significantly in the area. You know, a lot of people said, I've been to Israel many, many times, and everywhere you go in that region, there were wall-to-wall soldiers. Well, things have been changing in the last few years. There were fewer boots on the ground, and there were fewer human eyes. And the security coordinators in all the local villages in the area often expressed their concerns to the military, and it was to no avail. Now, the second variable that we have to look at is that the local community security forces were defanged. Historically, the border villages were regarded as a significant line of defense against terrorist intrusions. But due to overconfidence in the recently enhanced fence and the enforcement of gun control policies that were enacted in recent years, the military reduced the number of security weapons that were dispensed amongst the 57 locations in the Gaza border region. And the majority of the remaining weapons were removed from the homes of the security detail members, and they were put in the village's secure vault. In other words, they're not readily accessible. Typically, only 2 or 3 weapons were allowed per village outside of the vault, and they were allowed in the security coordinator's home. Furthermore, the village security details were no longer being trained to fight terrorists, they were being trained to fight agricultural crime. Remember, with that border fence being completed, they assumed there was no threat of terrorist incursion. Now, this de-arming policy wouldn't have been an issue in a situation where the community received, maybe a 5 or a 10-minute warning before the arrival of the hostiles. They could have got together, went to their secure vault, opened it up, pulled the weapons and ammo out, pulled their flak vests out, whatever they had, and they would be ready. But in the current situation, the villages suffered a surprise attack with somewhere between 0 warning and maybe 30 seconds to a minute warning. They had almost no warning. And typically there was no time to retrieve the weapons from the security vault. Now, the situation in the villages would have turned out much different if the security detail members had been allowed to have handguns and rifles in their homes like they had been allowed to historically. Now, the third variable is that the security establishment was confident that the enemy was deterred. The general consensus amongst the military and the intelligence communities was that the combination of the fence and their high-tech electronic surveillance and the Israeli sea and air superiority and their past successes on the battlefield was more than sufficient to deter Hamas or any other terrorist organization from making efforts beyond an occasional rocket launch or a petty incursion or some small-scale terrorist attack. It was not even in their thinking that something this broad, this extensive, this devastating would ever be attempted, much less pulled off. The fourth variable that we have to bear in mind is that the outposts, the military outposts in the south, were undermanned. Numerous reporters had made tours in the region over the past few years and toured the defense posts and the defense outposts. And they also made interviews with the security detail members and with the security coordinators on many of the villages. And there was widespread agreement outside of the military that the outposts in the Gaza region were undermanned. There was an impressive array of fences and sophisticated observation, sensing, and communication systems. It might be the most sophisticated system in the world. But there were not enough boots on the ground in the outposts, and there were not enough boots on the ground conducting physical patrols. The military was well prepared to respond to small-scale intrusions that were triggered. A warning was triggered by their warning system. But the military, according to these investigative reporters and according to who they'd interviewed in some of these villages, the military did not appear to be prepared and to be vigilant for intrusions where the warning system was somehow first compromised, much less being prepared for an intrusion of this scale and sophistication. The fifth variable that we need to bear in mind is that there was a massive intelligence community failure. There was too much emphasis in general on technology and not enough emphasis on boots on the ground in physical patrols. Another point that was lax was the violent ideology of Hamas was underestimated, at least by many. Another one was that the threat posed by Hamas was downplayed by the military command and by Shin Bet, although they were aware of some unusual training, sometimes within a kilometer of the fence. But when they looked all this at what they saw going on that was a little bit unusual and they looked at the historical precedent for how they were able to respond, and they looked at the historical precedent for how the terrorist groups acted, they did not see this coming. Now, you might say they dropped the ball, and I'm sure that they are going to agree that they dropped the ball, and they are going to change their policies from this point forwards. Another point was that Hamas's tactical abilities were vastly underestimated. Their abilities with small unit assault teams in an organized campaign against multiple targets was severely underestimated. It will not be underestimated in the future. I'll guarantee you that they will never make this mistake again. The sixth problem they faced, the sixth variable, is that there was significantly reduced manpower due to the holiday. Many of the soldiers in the region had been sent home for the holiday, which was Simchat Torah. The seventh variable that we need to take into consideration is that there was two big policy failures on the part of the government and foreign governments that gave Hamas an upper hand. The first one is the work visas. Tens of thousands of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip were granted work visas in Israel, and many of them were working in the Jewish settlements near Gaza. Now, in my mind, this was a mistake. Should never have happened. Knowing that 90% of the population supported Hamas and wanted to see Israel extinguished should have been a red flag. There shouldn't have been work visas for these people. And it turns out that some of the workers in some of the villages near Gaza spied for years, gathering intel about the villages, drawing maps, determining strengths and weaknesses. This was a colossal failure here. Now, the second policy failure isn't merely an Israeli failure. It's a failure on the part of her allies, Europe and America. Hundreds of millions of dollars of foreign aid were poured into the Gaza Strip. And this money provided Hamas with the ability to build hundreds of miles of tunnels deep underground, some of them more than 200 feet underground, and fill them with weapons and ammunition and ordnance and food and water and supplies for a long, drawn-out war. Now, the eighth variable that we need to take into consideration is the internal conflict in the nation. Israel was divided and distracted by internal conflict, as for instance, the Supreme Court issue. And Iran and Hamas exploited this division and this distraction, and they did an awesomely good job at it. Now, the last point, the ninth point that needs to be considered is that this attack was well planned and well executed. First of all, in the minutes before the attack, spies dressed as farmers approached the fence for recon on the IDF activity. They tracked the usual patrols, which they'd been tracking for a while. They reported their movements, and they gave the all-clear signals for stretches of the fence where they could make their entry locations after the patrol had passed. About 6:30 a.m., a massive barrage of rockets and mortars was launched at Israel, and this set off rocket alarms in many Gaza communities and many military posts and outposts. So now the chaos has started. Now, this barrage was focused primarily on the bases where the IDF had surveillance and communication systems. So while they were firing on the bases to distract the personnel on those bases, Hamas used drones to drop explosives on communication and surveillance installations that were along the fence, that were on the bases, and that were at the outposts. And at this point of the attack, nobody in any of the posts or outposts knew that this was anything more than a few rockets landing locally. Now, these attacks largely cut off the Gaza Division's command and control systems. And this hindered them from calculating and reporting the scale of the incursion to their higher-ups. It also hindered their communication with their subordinate outposts that were in the region. And at the same time that this attack was going on the communication and surveillance systems and on the bases and the command and control buildings, the Hamas also used drones to drop ordnance on tanks and on the track and shoot remote control installations. Now, Hamas used this lengthy rocket mortar and drone attack on the military bases to give their soldiers an entry window. Under the cover of this continued assault, and with the disruption of the surveillance and communication systems, the Hamas forces gathered at more than 24 locations along the fence line unnoticed and unopposed. Their breacher teams came along and they opened up holes in the fence with explosives and with heavy equipment. And then the Hamas jihadists came racing through those openings in groups of 15 or more in trucks and in jeeps and on motorcycles and other forms of transportation. Now, the attack was very broad and very sweeping, and I think a lot of people going down the conspiracy theory path have overlooked this point. The outposts and the posts in the entire region, whether the Gaza Division, whether units from the paratrooper brigade like their reconnaissance units, and the 2 battalions from the Golani brigade that were in the area, their posts were all attacked simultaneously. At some of the outposts, the men were just getting ready for the day, or were even sleeping still, and they were without their weapons, so they were unable to offer much resistance. A large Hamas force captured the Erez crossing that was closed for the Simchat Torah holiday, and then they entered the base and killed or kidnapped the soldiers that were there. Other Hamas contingents entered the Nahal Oz military outpost, the Gaza Division base, the Kasufim outpost, and the Magan outpost. At all locations, they first took out the lookout observers and the command and communication posts, and they destroyed the communication systems, and this hindered the ability of the post or the outpost to report their status or communicate with other bases. In other words, this was total communication chaos. And another contingent went and took out the police station in Sderot. And the outnumbered police actually fled. Now, there was tremendous chaos at this point. Because the command and control facilities were first strike targets, many of the local commanders were killed early in the battle. The Gaza Division command post was cut off. General Rosenfeld was holed up in the war room at the Gaza Division base headquarters in Re'im with a few of his soldiers trying frantically to organize counterstrikes and rescue missions. But the situation was so bad at the division headquarters there that General Rosenfeld was reportedly called for an airstrike to neutralize the invaders. So this was pretty desperate for a general to reportedly call for an airstrike on his own position. Now, because the communications were down, each platoon-sized outpost was on its own. And each one thought that they were either the only one being attacked or they thought that they were the one that was bearing the brunt of the attack. And nobody realized until after the fact just how extensive the scope of this attack was. And the command and control abilities of the region were so hindered in the early hours of the battle that when helicopter gunships finally got in the air, they were receiving their instructions via personal cell phones. Now, when it comes to the attack on the villages, it has to be understood that the villages were attacked at the same time that all of the military outposts and police stations were being attacked. So this stuff went on at the same time. So If you're in one of the kibbutzim or one of the other outlying villages and you're calling the military for help, they were typically under attack themselves. Now, and this is the primary reason why the army was unable to respond in a timely manner right at the beginning of the conflict. Many of them were in a fight for their own lives. Now, at many of these kibbutzim, the guards attempted to resist the attacks, but they were badly outnumbered. And the attackers had the advantage of heavy machine guns and incendiary devices, and they managed to kill the guards at many of these villages. Many of the security guards at the villages perished. And in these early conflicts, many soldiers from the Parachute Brigade and from the Golani Brigade that were in the region, who were stationed there to help guard the villages, they came to the rescue, or at least attempted to. And oftentimes, when they got to the kibbutz, or they got to the village, or they got to an adjacent outpost, or they got to a surveillance post, they were ambushed when they got there. There were at least 70 Golani fatalities and approximately 150 wounded in the early days of the conflict. Now, there were many major targets in this attack. And when these little small groups of Hamas terrorists streamed across the border, they were attacking the towns and the villages and the military outposts and the police stations very quickly and at the same time. They rolled into, it's about 25 towns and communities, some of them as far as 15 miles from the border. They rolled into 7, maybe more, of the outposts and bases, and 2 extensive outdoor activity positions. Now, there were other places that saw action, but not to the scope and degree that these cities and outposts saw action. Now, one last point I want to make, and that's I want to debunk a common fallacy about the morning. It is often stated that it was 7 hours before soldiers first responded, and this is simply not true. The soldiers in the Gaza Division, along with the members of the paratroop brigades and the Golani Brigade, did what they could right from the very beginning, but they were hindered by the massiveness of the attack, the fewness of their numbers, and the chaos of the situation. Many commanding officers were killed right in the first hour of the battle. And so as this battle unfolded, commanding officers were taking up any soldiers that they could come across under their wing, making the best of a bad situation. Oftentimes you had an officer with only 4 or 5 soldiers under him fighting a couple dozen Hamas terrorists who were well equipped and well trained. The soldiers that were sent to relieve the kibbutzes or the military outpost or an observation post were often ambushed when they got there. And the soldiers took heavy casualties. Now, another point that needs to be understood: the government officially activated the reservists, at least some units of them, 2 hours after the attack started. And the first reinforcements from outside the area started arriving about 10 a.m., which is about 3.5 hours after the attack. These were mostly special forces soldiers and counter-terrorist specialists from the Israeli police, and these were, just due to the contingencies of the situation, were forced to organize themselves into small units and go into the battle on their own. There was also reports that there were gunships in the air in the region in the first 3 hours, though they had to receive communications from ground control and from headquarters via cell phone communication. But from that point on, after that 3.5 hour mark, troops began to pour into the area, many of them by taking whatever communication or travel they could get. Some of them hitchhiked in. Now, it is true, and it's a painful fact, that many of the villages, or at least some of the villages, were not relieved for 7 to 12 hours. There was just too much chaos, too few soldiers, and the normal communication channels were down until much later into the day. All in all, in that fateful time, there were over 300 soldiers and about 60 police officers that were killed. So the soldiers and the police force did respond, but there was not enough boots on the ground to adequately respond, considering the circumstances, the massive scope of the attack, and that their command and control was largely damaged, their surveillance equipment was largely damaged, and their communications equipment were largely damaged. So in conclusion, hopefully this video will help you to see that we have a ready explanation lying right here on the surface for how the 25 or so villages could have suffered such a tragedy. As I stated at the start of this video, never accept a conspiracy theory explanation for a situation if a mundane explanation explains it. And folks, this mundane explanation with 9 points very adequately explains what happened on that fateful morning of October 7th. So keep looking up, folks. This is a discouraging report in many ways, but keep looking up. There's a lot of discouraging things that are going on in this world. And the odds are high that this current war is either going to set the stage for Psalm 83 or it's going to morph into that glorious event. At either rate, the prophetic convergence is accelerating around the world. The darkness is gathering. The storm is thickening. The storm is getting worse. And it's not very long now until the Lord Jesus descends from heaven to take his church out of the world. So keep looking up. Eyes wide open, brain engaged, heart on fire. We'll see you next time.